Welcome to Lives in Song, a series from Opera Rara with me, Flora Willson, looking at the lives of composers and other musicians through their music. This season, we're focused on the man responsible for some of the best-known music in all opera, though his most popular works have tended to obscure the rest of his output. Giacomo Puccini was born just before Italy itself. He came of age as a composer as Giuseppe Verdi's career wound down, and he lived to own motorcars, use the telephone, and supply the recording industry with some of its earliest hits. This season, I'll be joined by an array of expert guests as we explore Puccini's world and life. I'm so glad you can join us. If you haven't already done so, don't forget to subscribe or follow to make sure you don't miss any subsequent episodes. And of course, we're on all the major social media platforms, so just search for Opera Rara. Well, today's episode is all about Puccini's childhood and musical upbringing, so we've got some glorious music to look forward to. I'm joined here in the Creative Kin studio in London by Ditlev Rindom, opera scholar extraordinaire. There is a lot to talk about today, so let's get going. Ditlev, welcome to Creative Kin. It's great to have you in the studio.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, you're new to Lives in Song, but you're certainly not new to Opera Rara. You've recently finished a really big piece of work that's in the process of becoming, well, the next Opera Rara recording we all need on our shelves. Tell us a bit about that.
Absolutely, yes. So I've been working with Opera Rara for the last few years on a number of different projects. And the one we're working on together at the moment is La Rondine in the final version of this opera from 1921. And it's going to be the first time it's ever been recorded and the first time in a century that it's actually been performed at all. So it's going to be a really big event for Puccini lovers, of course, but also I think anyone who loves rare opera. It's going to be a real thrill to hear this.
And we're going to be talking some more about your edition of La Rondine later in this season, in fact. Before then, though, let's talk in slightly more general terms. We've known each other for years as academic colleagues, and Puccini and his music is actually something we share as a research interest, isn't
Absolutely.
it? Absolutely. Tell me, what interests you about Puccini as a researcher?
I think what interests me about Puccini as a researcher is also what interests me about Puccini as an opera lover in a way. I think what's so fascinating about him as a figure is that in each opera, it's just he takes you to a completely different time and place. He's a composer who had an absolute fear of repeating himself, but was always looking for a radically new topic. And I think that really reflected his much bigger interest in music of all different kinds. He was fascinated by French opera, by Wagner, but also music from far, really far away, non-Western music, popular music, actually, as we also find in La Rondine. And that really reflects the world he was living in, one in which he travelled to the Americas, he went to Egypt, he could engage with new kinds of recording technologies with cinema in a way that really marks a new change, a new era for opera, actually.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that, because I think I've always been really intrigued by the way he kind of sits on the knife edge between the 19th and the 20th centuries.
Absolutely.
That he's so rooted in the Italian opera tradition of the 19th century, and yet he was so much a man of his time, and he was so interested in being modern and in creating something that felt sort of self-consciously modern at times.
Absolutely. And I think with his music, you really, in each opera, in each stage of his life, you feel all of the tension that accompanied that he's fascinated by what's new, what can be done with the orchestra, what the new musical styles around him are like. But he's also in contact with a lot of the values and conventions and priorities of what Italian opera had been all through the previous century. And I think seeing that play out in a different way in each opera is just so fascinating as a listener, as an opera lover, as a researcher.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously you've already gestured to this, that, you know, we sit here as researchers, but we are also opera lovers. Do you remember your own first experience of Puccini's music?
I'm not sure I do, but I think I can probably still guess what it was. I think
Maybe it was the same as mine.
I'm sure it must have been Pavarotti singing Nessun Dorma. We're of the age in which that was the one. And of course, I'm sure I didn't think Puccini in that moment.
So this was the World Cup final in 1994. Pavarotti, three tenors, in fact, singing Nessun Dorma in Rome. Yeah,
exactly.
Quite something.
And after that, I think, like a lot of people, it was really Tosca, La Bohème, Madame Butterfly that drew me in initially as an opera lover. But I think I'm probably not unique either in as my relationship with the composer has developed, being drawn more and more to sort of the extreme ends of his career. Obviously, the very late part of his career, things like Rondine and Trittico, and wondering what would have happened to his career if he carried on living. But also, actually, the other complete extreme end, the very beginnings of his life, and actually wondering where did that come from? I mean, he wasn't a child prodigy, and yet right at the beginning of his life, his career, you already see the seeds of these ideas that were going to come to fruition so amazingly a few years later.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that there is, in some ways, there's such consistency through his output, even while the language does change. It does kind of become hugely more sophisticated and well, it reflects the fact that times were changing around him. He kept up to date. But as you say, you know, he died relatively young, didn't he? And therefore, had he lived a bit longer, you know, had he lived as long as Verdi, for instance, you know, presumably, well, we'd have had a finished Turandot, but maybe we would have had another opera as well.
Absolutely. And I think also with Puccini, there's always the question about the projects he was interested in and they never actually pursued. And famously, he was intrigued by doing an opera about Marie Antoinette. And this really consumed him for several years, the idea of doing this opera. And you can't but wonder, what would that have been like if he'd actually gone through with it? And maybe it would have been a bit like Manon Lescaut. Who knows? Who
knows? Exactly. We can only imagine. But I mean, and of course, today we are focused on Puccini long before he became famous and before he wrote any of the works that, you know, many of us will know and love. But let's just remind ourselves of what this can sound like. Well, you won't catch us playing much music as familiar as that on this podcast. That was, of course, Un bel dì, One Fine Day, as it's usually translated, from Puccini's 1904 opera Madama Butterfly. It was sung there by soprano and opera rara artist ambassador Emanuele Iaho, with Andrea Battistoni conducting the Orchestra della Comunitat Valenciana. That's a track on her Anima Rara album on the Opera Rara label. And Emanuela herself will be joining me in the studio later in this season to discuss the experiences she's had of singing Puccini's music. Ditlev, you don't have to hear much more than that one long phrase, do you, to see why, you know, it's a number with such amazing popular appeal.
Of course, and I think always with Puccini, you only have to hear a few bars of it. You're immediately brought in to the character, to their emotional state, and often to a place, to an atmosphere. Everyone says it, in a way it's like a film. He just absolutely locates the listener in a particular place and environment straight away, and you want to know more.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, at this point, we need to take ourselves to the place where Puccini was himself born and the time at which that happened. He was born in 1858 in Lucca. Tell us a bit about his family in those early years, Ditlev.
Puccini is an interesting case because he was from an incredibly musical family with a very, very long lineage in it. So he was the fifth generation of musicians in his family. They'd all, actually the previous four generations, all been organists at the cathedral in Lucca. So it was pretty much expected that was the career path he was going to go down. In a way, this is very surprising to us because obviously he's not known for his church music. That's not the way his career developed. But perhaps it might have done in different circumstances. But he grew up absolutely around this church environment where his very first professional experiences were playing the organ, singing as a treble in the choirs, doing bits of conducting. That was really the environment that he was very familiar with growing up. And the opera house really came later to him.
And did he have that kind of those early educational experiences in music? Was that with his family? Was he effectively learning just as an apprenticeship almost? To
some extent, his life was very disrupted earlier on. So, I mean, it's actually possible to visit his childhood home now in Lucca. It's a museum.
I think you've been there, haven't you?
And I've been there, and actually, when you walk in, it seems quite grand. It's been beautifully restored, very beautiful large rooms. It has his Steinway piano in. But you forget, firstly, that he's been beautifully restored, but also he was one of 7 children. So there were a lot of mouths to feed in this particular household. It would have been a packed place, multi-generational living. But Puccini's father died when Puccini was 6. So this must have been, for his mother, of course, a huge blow. Emotionally, financially, practically. And it would have affected Puccini's education as well, because of course, it would have been expected his father would have been a pivotal figure in training him as a musician. Instead, his uncle, his mother's brother, comes into the picture, who actually took on part of his father's work and took over Puccini's education early on. So part of it was in the family, absolutely, but he also enrolled in the local conservatoire quite early on during his teens. So he had a more formal education at the same time.
Do we know much about what sorts of things he might actually have been taught to do? Because obviously music education isn't quite the same thing as what's going on in music venues at a particular time. So do we have any sense of what he was learning?
We have some sense. Puccini's childhood is quite difficult to recover in certain respects, but we do know about the kinds of things students were learning in Italian conservatoires. Obviously, a lot of harmony and counterpoint. He would have been writing his fugues. All of those sorts of exercises that were absolutely normal all across the Italian peninsula. And this reflects actually the kind of compositions that remain from his adolescence, where he was writing a lot of his quote-unquote more academic pieces, testing out that he really knew the rules as they were practiced, and was also meant to prepare him for the career he was expected to have in the church.
Yeah. Of course, it's easy to forget now that Italy didn't exist yet when Puccini was born. He was born specifically, in Lucca, so then that's in Tuscany. What was the political situation there at this stage of the Risorgimento? I mean, what country was he born in?
So he will have been born in the Duchy of Lucca, I think, but then pretty much straight away it became part of the Duchy of Tuscany, which was then absorbed into Italy in 1861. Okay. So this is happening really in the first 2 or 3 years of Puccini's life. This obviously politically is a hugely dramatic event. That said, the previous generations of his family had actually travelled to study. So it's not that he would necessarily have been expected to have remained completely local. His father had studied in Bologna, for instance. So the idea that Puccini would at some point move away from his hometown to get a broader experience perhaps wasn't so unusual. But obviously in terms of Italy's broader culture, it had a massive political effect, but also it's a period in which just everything was changing in the country. When you're having the railways finally coming into the country, it's becoming connected, it's becoming more international. And these things will shape his life in such massive ways, even as a student, actually.
What kind of music might he have heard as a teenager around him, aside from the church music that was obviously there in the cathedral? Do we have a sense of what was being performed in Lucca, or where else he might have gone?
Well, I mean, there is an opera house in Lucca, and we can see the kinds of things that were being performed there during his childhood, adolescence. I mean, a lot of Verdi, unsurprisingly, a lot of Donizetti, Rossini, also some earlier works, occasionally a bit of Mozart, some Puccini as well. Famously, there's a story that when Puccini was about 16 years old, he walked the 50 kilometers there and back to Pisa to see Aida, which was this huge event in his adolescence. It's not quite Bach walking 400 kilometers to see Buxtehude, but it's a big journey for someone to do when they're a teenager. But clearly this was a special outing. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect to see just around the corner.
Yeah. Well, sadly, we can't transport you to 1860s Northern Italy, but we can listen to part of an opera that was premiered just the year before Puccini was born.
Suona ogni labbro il mio nome, oh Maria, forse in breve potrei dirvi tuo sposo. Alcun vecco che via si va. Concedi, forte amor, sì, crudele.
part of the duet Suono ogni labbro il mio nome, My Name Sounds on Every Lip, from the prologue of Verdi's opera Simon Boccanegra in its original 1857 version. We heard the baritone Germán Alcántara as Boccanegra himself and bass William Thomas as Jacopo Fiasco, with the Halle Orchestra conducted by Mark Elder. And you can listen to the whole opera, of course, in the recording released in spring 2025 on the Opera Rara label. Ditlev, this is proper 1850s Verdi, isn't it? Amazing. There's still the recitative to start. You know, funny to be reminded that Puccini was born into a world where the recitative was still a normal part of an operatic form.
Absolutely. And yet at the same time, and when we listen to an opera like that, I mean, there's things about it that you think, well, it's not such a big step from Otello in some ways. I mean, it's that kind of dark colour, isn't it? Those low voices, the dark orchestration. You know, in a way you think that Verdi at this time in the 1850s, he was experimenting so much. A piece like this and then Un ballo in maschera coming soon afterwards. In a way, Puccini wasn't so different later on in his career in really looking for that very different subject each time. He never wanted to repeat himself. Yeah,
of course. And here, I mean, what we just heard, there's so much dramatic power in the way Verdi is writing for orchestra. Even in the recitative, in fact, it's got such drive. It's doing a lot in a way that does join up with what Puccini would go on to do later himself. I love the kind of dialogue between Fiesco's melody there as he and Boccanegra are sort of confronting each other. It's this absolute head-to-head moment. But it's the dialogue between the singer and the orchestra as well.
Exactly. And I think it just goes to show how experimental Verdi was actually at this point in the 1850s and with this work in particular. And that's something that clearly that would have inspired Puccini. But also, I think it goes to show that we might be tempted to think that everything extremely experimental in Italian opera really happens towards the end of the late 19th century, but actually it is already happening really in the 1850s.
Yeah, this is that moment in Verdi's career where he's really pushing forwards effectively and searching for new things. Verdi aside, I suppose, who were the other major figures in Italian opera in the 1850s and 60s? Or perhaps I should say in Italy's operatic world. Who else mattered?
Well, in terms of Italian composers, after Verdi, you would certainly have Mercadante, was very successful, had massive hits that were played at all the main theatres that really travelled. You have a good number of comic opera composers still going strong. People like the Ricci brothers were very successful. Nicola de Giosa down in Naples was writing a lot of very, very popular operas. You also have other composers like Enrico Petrella, who wrote an opera Joan that was done very, very widely. So there are quite a few composers who are having big hits, but none, of course, to match Verdi or Mercadante in terms of the sheer number. But the 1860s is also this point in which more and more French operas are coming through. I mean, that's already happened to some extent in the 1840s and 50s when Meyerbeer gradually starts to arrive.
And he really was the figurehead of French grand opera. That was what he was known for.
Absolutely. But of course, there had already been that generation of composers of Rossini and Donizetti who had gone to Paris and their operas had come back to Italy in Italian translation. And this had sort of paved the way for all of these French operas to start to appear. But it's in the 1860s that things like Gounod's Faust first comes to Italy. And this really marks a sea change in the repertoire.
It's interesting, isn't it, that Italian opera somehow became a bit less parochial, became slightly less Italian and slightly more open to international influence at this moment.
Absolutely. And of course, this will define Puccini's career in all sorts of ways. We can see that from the sort of things that he then finally could see when he went to Milan, when he studied the things he was interested in seeing at the theatres. It wasn't just the Italian works, it was everything. He was absolutely voracious when it came to listening.
Do we need to talk about Wagner at this point? I think we might do.
I think we might do.
Tell us about, I mean, Wagner has an interesting career in Italy, doesn't he? But tell us a bit about what was going on as far as Wagner's works were concerned in Italy.
So Wagner's works first came to Italy in the 1870s. They came in a rather piecemeal fashion. Obviously, there was a lot of awareness of his works, about his writings as well, but it took time for these pieces finally to arrive. And it's perhaps not so surprising given the Italian operatic tradition that generally audiences seem to have warmed towards works like Lohengrin rather than the very late works. But they were done very successfully in all the major theatres by the end of the 19th century. And of course, Puccini wanted to hear them. And importantly, also, when he was a student, he was exposed to Wagner's works. So this was a fundamental part of his operatic training. It was there from really from the very beginning of his serious training as an operatic composer. This was a reference point to know about.
Yeah, and of course, there was the fact that other composers around him and before him, in fact, had been sort of open to influence, even though Wagner's works weren't staged until the 1870s. The kind of the way he was fomenting ideas about music was trickling down into some of what was going on in Italy. Before we talk more about this, let's hear what some of this more international, perhaps even German-style Italian music might sound like. Here's a passage of orchestral music from Arrigo Boito's 1868 opera Mefistofele, and you'll need to listen in because this starts really quietly. The Orchestra della Comunitat Valentiana sounding gloriously dark in the introduction to the aria L'altra notte in fondo al mare, the other night at the bottom of the sea, from Boito's Mefistofele, conducted by Andrea Battistoni. And that's another track from Emanuele Iaho's Anima Rara disc. Ditlev, this is a very different, well, it's not actually entirely different from Simon Boccanegra, but it's a different world from, say, Rossini or Donizetti or some of the earlier 19th century Italian operas with that sort of the brightness that we tend to associate with them. The orchestral colour here is remarkable.
It is, and it's one of those things that makes Boito such a fascinating figure. I mean, I think it's actually in a way hard to underestimate how important Boito was in the history of 19th century Italian opera, despite the fact that we actually don't know very many of his works very well. And part of the reason is because he was absolutely prolific writer. We know him as the librettist for Verdi, but also he was writing librettos, he was writing essays that were absolutely crucial in reshaping what the cultural landscape in Italy was like for opera. He was someone who was very explicit about the fact that he thought Italy basically needed to up its game. Culturally, it needed to become closer in spirit to Germany and to France. And he was part of this artistic movement in Milan at this time, the Scapigliatura, who basically were modelling themselves on writers like Flaubert, Baudelaire. They were a little bit like the angry young men of the 1860s, not the 1960s. They really wanted change.
Just remind us what this term means, because it is a slightly odd one, isn't it?
Yes, literally would mean the dishevelled ones, and they're making a point. They're too cool, they're too important to dress in
basically
a smart way.
Punks. Italian operatic
They're essentially
punks.
1860s punks. Very prolific ones, though. And this movement goes on for sort of 20, 30 years at least, and will also shape the very beginning of Puccini's career through the contacts he then makes in Milan, which I imagine you'll be talking about in the next episode. But this is absolutely crucial for getting writers, for getting composers to think about Italian opera can be different if it engages with trends abroad. And famously, Boito said, formula must be banished. You know, we've had enough of caballettas. We need to really have a different way of thinking about opera, and the orchestra will be especially important here.
Yeah, so interesting. Whether Boito meant to do this or not, he ended up really offending Verdi, didn't he?
He did, yes.
Because Verdi took this to be an attack on him, that it was his formulas, his music that was being shunted out the way, that he was old hat. And
which is amazing.
Guys...
Amazing when you hear that straight after Simon Boccanegra, which seems so close in spirit to what Boito was actually doing.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, it's easy for us to overlook, or too easy, really, that the fact that Verdi himself was changing Italian opera not only through kind of darkness, but in other vital ways as well. I mean, his interest in realism, for instance,
Definitely.
We associate this with the Verismo composers, with Puccini, but Verdi was already doing this in some of his earlier works in the 1850s, and above all, from La Traviata. So let's just remind ourselves of what one of Verdi's earliest forays into operatic realism actually sounded like. Part of Violetta's aria Addio del passato, Farewell to the Past, from Verdi's 1853 opera La Traviata, sung by Emanuela Jaho on her Anima Rara album on the Opera Rara label. Ditlev, I love that bit where the oboe takes over from Violetta, who's too ill to sing, basically, and the oboe cuts in and takes her tune.
Of course, it's like the end of Lucia di Lammermoor with the cello. I mean, it's the same idea. It's just so beautifully conceived.
It's
incredibly
and also
powerful.
And sung like that, daringly slowly, actually, really having to control breath, which makes the point.
Absolutely, and feeling that actually breathing in is part of the musical phrase, that the listener's drawn in with that bodily experience of singing.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's something so extraordinary, I think, about Verdi actually making breathing and production of voice into part of what this aria ends up being about. That, he's got a tubercular heroine and he finds a way to make that all aligned
to make
dramatically.
Breathing part of the structure of the piece. Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely.
And, what is that if not realism?
Absolutely. And I think it's one of the major reasons why we often find during Puccini's career, and also that of his contemporaries, that Traviata seems to hang around as this sort of ghost that they're all inspired by. We can't imagine La Bohème without the figure of La Traviata in the background. Zaza, the same sort of idea that these are women who have suffered and who live in morally complicated lives in Paris, and it's definitely Traviata which is really there as a sort of an influence, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, and it really does put Verdi back into the picture as well of, the absolutely vital step to understand Puccini. There were considerable anxieties accruing around the Italian opera tradition, actually, weren't there, by this sort of later point, not so much Traviata, but thinking again to as Puccini was growing up, as he was sort of becoming a teenager. There were kind of concerns that there was some power running out of the Italian operatic tradition.
Definitely. We find this, I think, particularly strongly in the 1860s, where there's real anxiety amongst a lot of the Italian establishment, amongst the musical press, that they're just not having enough successful works, pieces that are being done repeatedly season after season that are really entering the repertoire. Things are just failing. And I think this does reflect in part the fact that people were being exposed to new repertoire and expectations were changing of what opera needed to sound like. And of course, then you have a crisis that emerges. That said, I think if we start to move forward into the 1870s and the 1880s, we're perhaps maybe misreading what it exactly what it looked like at the time. I mean, there were composers like Puccini's colleague Catalani, who actually was a bright star of the Italian operatic scene, who had very successful works, but then just tragically died young. And he might have gone on to be an equally big player in the musical world during Puccini's lifetime, but it didn't happen. Figures like Ponchielli, who was Puccini's teacher, a huge success with La Gioconda, also wrote a number of other works. But definitely there is a real sense of concern about what Italian opera is supposed to be like. How on earth do we respond to Boito's call, basically, to modernise, to absorb new influences while retaining a sense of Italian opera being Italian, particularly in Italy being a new country? But that becomes rather important. And that's obviously going to be a theme that then runs through a lot of Puccini's criticism as time goes on, but will also really shape the way he's thinking about what opera should be.
Yeah, exactly. And, the fact that Verdi is aging and periodically threatening to stop composing altogether at this stage is also problematic, presumably stoking any anxieties out there.
I think so. I mean, it's funny with Verdi. I mean, in a way, the fact that he had such an extraordinarily long life and career, in a way, makes us think of the sort of period from the 1840s to the 1890s to be one long period. And in a way, it really isn't once you actually start to get into the fine detail. But also, he changed so much. And, in a way, you can't imagine Verismo without an opera like Otello, which is really, I mean, it's like Pagliacci in so many ways in terms of the three characters who are, and one manipulating the other, and in terms of the sheer vocal demands as well. So, yes, I think Verdi's threatened retirement was always hanging over. That was a problem, certainly. But there were people coming through. I think it was really a question of establishing what would a national style be like. And that was something that really shaped the reputations and the careers of so many people.
And I suppose on the one hand, that's a sort of patriotic need for a new sense of cultural heritage in a new country. On the other hand, there's also the commercial problem that for a figure like Giulio Ricordi, who's been working, or indeed the whole Ricordi firm, who's been working with Verdi very profitably for a very long time and working with the Italian opera tradition for a very long time, exporting it profitably across the world, not even just across Europe. I suppose it's for them for Ricordi and for his competitors, figures like Sonzogno, Eduardo Sonzogno, where this becomes really tricky, that they're looking around thinking, okay, but who's next? What can we find here? Absolutely.
And in a way, Sonzogno was extremely canny because what he did was to import lots of French music and to have it translated, and he became the importer for Gounod. It was the importer for Carmen, Bizet's Carmen, which again was hugely successful. So he had a body of works, albeit foreign ones, that he could rent out to theatres. But of course, practically, all publishers needed new Italian composers that were going to make their name and were going to make the fortunes of these publishing houses. So, of course, it was an economic crisis too.
Yeah, and I guess that's where Sonzogno's competition in 1883 comes in, where he runs this competition for a new one-act opera that Puccini enters. And in a sense, that's, of course, that's where Puccini's own music comes in, and where we'll pick up in our next episode, when I'll be joined by Puccini expert Alexandra Wilson to look at his very first opera, Le Villi, as we continue our exploration of Puccini's life through his music. We're almost out of time for this episode, but it wouldn't be Lives in Song without our closing Ask Opera Rara segment. So you've shared some great questions this week. As always, if you'd like to get in touch with a query, no matter how large or small, please do email us at ask@opera-rara.com or use the hashtag AskOperaRara on our social channels. The links are also in the show notes. We love to hear from you, and we do respond to every single message, so don't be shy. First then tonight, Ditlev, we've got a message from Seth in Washington, D.C., who asks, are there any other composers who were working around the same time as Puccini who you think deserve more attention? So, I think I've got an answer for this. Maybe I'll share mine while you have a think. I don't know whether it's cheating, Seth, to go into the French repertory, but I would say André Messager is a really interesting composer, almost direct contemporary of Puccini. He wrote all sorts of things, but he mainly wrote light operas, sort of operettas. But he also was the conductor of the first of a performance of Wagner's Ring Cycle in Paris. He ran Covent Garden Opera in London. He was this amazing kind of multitasking, multi-talented polymath, basically. And yeah, his light operas are much less well known than they should be, I think. They really are worth investigating. So that's my tip. What about yours?
Well, I'll answer for Italy, and since you've already gone for France, I think, given how long Puccini's career is, in a way it's hard to pick just one. But perhaps let's go with Smaraglia, who has a very interesting, rich career. Wrote some really ambitious works that were premiered at La Scala, conducted by Toscanini.
When was he working?
I mean, really the same period. I mean, he was all through the 1890s, early 20th century. Wrote really quite a few operas. Very varied as well. And again, a little bit like Puccini, someone who really wanted to try out different topics each time, wrote a sort of classic Verismo realist opera, but also wrote things that were more like fairy tales. Often very heavily influenced by Wagner, so they're big, complex pieces to put on, and that's probably why they're not done so much. But there's a lot of great music waiting to be discovered in those pieces, I think.
All right. Okay. There you go, Seth. Some names to look up. All right. So our second question tonight is from an Opera Rara follower on Facebook who asks, this is a good one for you, who asks, why is the new version of La Rondine that Opera Rara has been working on different from the version we know of now? Go on then, you've got about 30 seconds. How is it different?
Well, Puccini essentially completely reconceived this opera over having already premiered the version which we know from the recordings, he then reworked it entirely for a second version, and the final version we know has, first of all, new sections of music in Act 1 and in Act 3. That's completely new music. He completely reworked the middle of Act 2 to change all of the ensembles to give Prunière a more important part. He reworked all of the choral writing for the big quartet that everyone loves, and then particularly in Act 3 he reworked the dramaturgy and takes the story back actually to what the original idea was for La Rondine. The idea he was sent by his librettist in Vienna wasn't that Magda was going to make a cool-headed decision to leave at the end of the opera, but actually it's much more tragic. And Puccini writes in a letter, there cannot be a happy ending in Rondine. It has to be a tragedy at the end.
Wow, okay, so he returned the tragedy. That's a trail, I think, for what we'll pick up that conversation a few episodes down the line. One final quick question for today from Lily in London, who asks, if you had to pick a favourite moment in Puccini, what would it be? There's quite a lot to choose from, isn't there? I'm going to go with an enormous cliche myself. I'm going to say the Te Deum in Tosca at the end of Act 1. All Guns Blazing doesn't really cover it. It's such spectacular music. It's Puccini, rather, not Verdi, definitely not Verdi, really showing what he can do with all these different forces that he's playing with. He's playing the orchestra like an organ, and it's absolutely extraordinary.
Great option. Well, I'll be a little bit contrary then and pick something very different. It's hard because, of course, the arias are amazing, and that these are the pieces that we all come to know first, be it Nessun Dorma or something else. I think the more time I spend with Puccini, what I find amazing are the little moments that would pass for nothing. It's the little offstage voices in Il Tibaro, which it lasts 30 seconds, but they give you this amazing sense of atmosphere. I love all of the orchestral passages. There was no one else of his generation, I think, who wrote such amazing orchestral music within operas. And the Madama Butterfly, I mean, that whole sequence where the night vigil, the music is just amazing. And, you're brought into the characters' crisis, essentially, in this incredible way, but with no one actually singing. So I think, in a way, those moments just show actually what he could do even when he didn't have a voice.
Yeah, amazing stuff. I think it's fair to say we really love the music of Puccini.
We love Puccini.
We're on his side. All right, well, that is it for this episode. Thank you, Ditlev Rindom, for sharing your expertise. We'll be welcoming you back later in this season. And thank you all for joining us from home or wherever you are. There are links to all of the music featured in today's episode in our show notes on Opera Rara's website. That's www.opera-rara.com. I'm Flora Willson, and my guest today was Ditlev Rindom. Lives in Song is produced for Opera Rara by Creative Kin. To find out more, visit creativekin.co.uk/song. Special thanks to our producer, Jason Caffrey. This show's executive producer is Zachary Vanderberg. Our audio engineer is Phoebe Murdoch, and our videographer is Robin Barrage. Lives in Song is brought to you by Opera Rara and by the generosity of listeners like you. Opera Rara is all about uncovering and sharing the hidden gems of the operatic world, giving new life to music that deserves to be heard. Your generosity helps us share rare operas and songs with audiences around the world. If you love Discovery as much as we do, you can help us keep the music alive by visiting www.opera-rara.com/support and making a donation. Thanks for listening and for being part of the Opera Rara community.